Hi, this is Donald here, and this is my review of Modern Man in Search of a Soul by Carl Jung. As an introduction to the book, Carl Jung was a Swiss psychologist who was one of the big pioneers of modern-day psychology, along with Freud and Adler, who were his colleagues, and at one point I believe he was also friends with Freud. This book was written in 1993, and it's really more of a collection of essays and academic writings, each roughly about 25 pages long. And the topics vary widely. They range from dream analysis, the state of the practice of psychotherapy at the time, Carl Jung's thoughts on Freud and his beliefs, religion, and others. Each of these topics are self-contained in a sense, so that's actually quite a benefit. You don't necessarily have to read this book in any order. You don't have to read everything if you don't want. You can just pick out an essay that you would like. That being said, having some kind of understanding of how Jung looks at things would help with your understanding of each of his essays. Regarding the physical copy that I read, I just got this cheap mass market copy. Nothing fancy, but it was a nice and classic book to take. I went on vacation to Alaska on a honeymoon actually, and I just carried this little book around with me. It was nice to read, easy, no complaints really. My thoughts on this book. The text of this book is dense, but always insightful and thought-provoking. It's really quite astounding because everything you read just reads so well, even though there's a lot of complicated subjects being discussed. It's fascinating reading this book, which was written in 1933. And you have to have a little perspective because 1933, we didn't really understand human psychology very well. And Jung lived in a time where it was really just kind of a blossoming profession. There was a lot of theories going about, a lot of discovery, a lot of experimentation. As such, psychotherapy at the time seemed to be somewhat like a blank canvas, and Jung painted his picture with broad, bold strokes. A lot of this psychology talk is mingled with his personal clinical experience, as well as philosophy and spiritualism and spiritual beliefs. For that reason, it's really like reading a philosophy text, somewhat similar to Plato in his writing style. Jung has his beliefs and he questions and he kind of goes through assumptions and comes to his conclusion. Almost like a self-dialogue. Granted, it's not quite as strict and academic as a philosophical work, but it's kind of philosophical-esque, I'd say. Jung really reasons his way through and tries to understand the workings of the mind, just like Plato and Socrates. Likewise, if you have interest in some of those old philosophical Greek texts, you will most certainly like Jung's works. Clearly, 1933, some of his concepts and beliefs and theories have been disproven or fallen out of favor, or there's not evidence to support them. However, a surprising number of his ideas are still relevant, and even more shockingly, some of his ideas are still unique and innovative to this day, and they were proposed about 80 years ago, which is really crazy. Jung is definitely a powerhouse of a thinker, and I don't think there's much disputing that. He was intellectually a genius. Difficulty-wise, Jung wasn't as bad as I thought. I was a little intimidated at first, but once I started reading it flows really nice. The translation is excellent. His sentences are dense, but at the same time, it's actually kind of an understandable style, especially the more you become familiar with it. One of the last books I read was Joseph Campbell's Hero with a Thousand Faces, and that book was a pain to read. That was really a struggle to get through. He talks about mythology and psychology and that kind of stuff, but Jung explains similarly difficult and challenging philosophical, psychological concepts, but in a way that makes a lot of sense to the layman. He had a very natural, sincere tone to his writing, which I didn't really find in Joseph Campbell. Jung's writing is sharp and has a powerful writing style to it without much fluff. And it's insane how long he can keep it up. The entire book, every paragraph seems kind of powerful in its own way. Jung has no shame in saying, hey, I'm proposing idea X, and it's just my guess. I don't know for sure, but let's roll with it. And that's a very sincere style, and it gives you, I think it gives the audience some sympathy to Jung and his ideas and how he speaks. I will also say Jung seems easier to read than Freud, and I tried reading Freud back when I was in college, and it was pretty challenging, and Freud had a very mechanical, cold, icy, robotic, sterile tone to it, and Jung is the opposite, very warm and human to it. It reads with life. Just so you get a taste of some of his writing and his style, I thought of a couple of quotes that stood out to me. Also, it would be good practice trying to figure out how to do this in a video. It is painful, there is no denying it, to interpret radiant things from the shadow side, and thus, in a measure, reduce them to their origins in dreary filth. But it seems to me to be an imperfection in things of beauty, and a weakness in man, if an explanation from the shadow side has a destructive effect. The horror which we feel for Freudian interpretations is entirely due to our own barbaric or childish naivete, which believes that there can be heights without corresponding depth, and which blinds us to the really final truth that, when carried to extremes, opposites meet. Our mistake would lie in supposing that what is radiant no longer exists because it has been explained from the shadow side. This is a regrettable error into which Freud himself has fallen. Yet the shadow belongs to the light as the evil belongs to the good, and vice versa. There are many people who become neurotic because they are only normal, as there are people who are neurotic because they cannot become normal. For the former, the very thought that you want to educate them to normality is a nightmare. Their deepest need is really to be able to lead abnormal lives. In doubtful cases, the resistances of the patient may serve as valuable signposts. I am inclined at the start to take deep-seated resistances seriously, strange as this may sound, for I am convinced that the doctor is not necessarily in a better position to know what is wanted than is the patient's own psychic constitution, which may be quite unconscious to the patient himself. This modesty of the part of the doctor is altogether appropriate in view of the situation today. Not only have we as yet no generally valid psychology, but what is more, the variety of psychic constitutions is untold, and there also exist more or less individual psyches which refuse to fit into any general scheme. Truth to tell, I have a very high opinion of fantasy. To me, it is actually the maternally creative side of the masculine spirit. When all is said and done, we are never proof against fantasy. It is true that there are worthless, inadequate, morbid, and unsatisfying fantasies whose sterile nature will be quickly recognized by every person endowed with common sense. But this, of course, proves nothing against the value of creative imagination. All the works of man have their origin in creative fantasy. What right have we, then, to depreciate imagination? In the ordinary course of things, fantasy does not easily go astray. It is too deep for that, and too closely bound up with the taproot of human and animal instinct. In surprising ways, it always rights itself again. The creative activity of the imagination frees man from his bondage to the nothing but, and liberates him in the spirit of play. A large majority of people have from time immemorial felt the need of believing in a continuance of life. The demands of therapy, therefore, do not lead us into any bypaths, but down the middle of the roadway trodden by humankind. And, therefore, we are thinking correctly with respect to the meaning of life, even though we do not understand what we think. Do we ever understand what we think? We only understand that thinking which is a mere equation, and from which nothing comes out but what we have put in. That is the working of the intellect. Though there's some writing examples, you can tell that he really speaks powerfully, even though he doesn't have all these statistics or numbers or psychological tests to back up. A lot of modern psychology books, they just have a ton of tests and data to back it up. Sample size might be terrible, right? But Jung, he doesn't have that, and he just relies on thought and thinking. And at the same time, he still manages to be very powerful. It's pretty cool. Would I recommend this book? Yeah, absolutely. This is a thought-provoking book, and a book worth reading and rereading, especially for those who are interested intellectually in psychology, but also in more of a spiritual leaning way. Clearly, some of his ideas have become less relevant, but the power of his ideas and thinking is still really nice to read, and frankly, sometimes inspiring. Jung is definitely a man on a sincere mission to discover the truth of the psyche, in a time of great awakening to the importance of psychology. It's a little hard to describe, but reading him is like really pure. It's just like pure thought. This was definitely a pleasant read. That being said, this book is somewhat challenging. Not super challenging, but somewhat challenging, but worth it. I don't recommend this book to those who are looking for a really easy read, because it will definitely take effort and time and patience to understand what he's talking about. That being said, I want to underline how accessible his writing style still is. It's not like an impenetrable, dense, philosophical book, right? You could definitely understand. You just have to slow down and think about it. And that is my review of Modern Man in Search of a Soul by Carl Jung. I hope you enjoyed the review. Let me know what you think below if you agree or disagree. Thanks.